The myth of a lawless frontier. The Wild West is remembered as a place without rules, a violent landscape where men settled disputes with guns, where towns were ruled by whoever was strongest, and where justice came only from the barrel of a revolver. This image has been repeated for over a century, reinforced by novels, films, and television. It feels instinctively true, but it is deeply misleading. The frontier was not lawless. It was something far more precarious. To understand frontier law, you must first abandon the modern idea of what law is supposed to look like. Today, law is institutional. It is written down, enforced by trained professionals, supported by courts, prisons, and permanent authority. Law today is slow, procedural, and abstract. It assumes stable populations, long memory, and fixed infrastructure. None of those conditions existed on the frontier. Frontier towns were temporary by nature. Many appeared almost overnight. A gold strike, a rail stop, or a cattle trail could turn empty land into a settlement of hundreds or thousands within weeks. The population was overwhelmingly male, heavily armed, and transient. People arrived with one purpose: to extract value and plan to leave as soon as they could. This constant movement made formal law nearly impossible to maintain. Governments could not keep pace. By the time a sheriff was appointed, the population had changed. By the time a court convened, witnesses had moved on. By the time paperwork arrived, the crime was already irrelevant. From the outside, this looked like chaos. But chaos is bad for business. And frontier towns, for all their rough edges, were businesses first and communities second. A town that could not control violence did not survive. Merchants would leave, supply routes would dry up, traders would avoid the area. Families would never arrive. Without families, there was no permanence. Without permanence, the town disappeared. So order was not optional, it was essential. The mistake modern observers make is assuming that order must come from formal authority. On the frontier, it did not. Order came from necessity. People quickly learned that survival depended on predictability, not fairness, not justice, predictability, knowing which behaviors were tolerated and which would bring consequences, knowing where lines were drawn, even if they were never written down. Those lines emerged naturally. Do not steal from locals. Do not disrupt commerce. Do not threaten women or children. Do not endanger the stability of the town. These rules were not moral principles. They were survival mechanisms. Other behaviors were often tolerated, even if they offended modern sensibilities. Gambling was common. Prostitution was widespread. Drinking was constant. These activities generated money, attracted workers, and did not inherently threaten stability. As long as they remained controlled, they were accepted. This selective tolerance confuses modern audiences. It creates the illusion of hypocrisy or lawlessness. In reality, it reveals the true function of frontier law, protecting the group, not enforcing morality. Frontier law was pragmatic to the point of brutality. It did not ask whether something was right. It asked whether something was dangerous. This distinction matters. A man who cheated strangers might be tolerated. A man who cheated locals was not. A drunken brawl might be ignored. A fight that spilled into the street and scared customers was punished. Violence was not condemned because it was immoral, but because it disrupted business. The frontier was governed by consequences, not ideals. Another misconception is that frontier communities were ignorant or unsophisticated. In reality, they were highly observant. In a small town, anonymity did not exist. Everyone watched everyone else. Behavior was noticed, remembered, and discussed. Information moved quickly. Saloons, boarding houses, general stores, and work camps acted as informal communication hubs. Stories were exchanged over meals and drinks. Names became shorthand. A person's past followed them everywhere. This collective memory was powerful. It meant that enforcement did not require constant violence. In most cases, it required only consensus. When a person became known as dangerous, unreliable, or disruptive, doors closed quietly. Jobs disappeared. Credit was denied. Conversations stopped. Punishment began long before fists or guns were ever involved. This is the critical point that popular portrayals miss. Frontier law was not primarily violent. It was social. Violence occurred when the system failed, not when it functioned properly. The absence of visible authority did not mean the absence of control. It meant that control was distributed. Everyone participated in enforcement, whether consciously or not. Approval and disapproval became tools. Inclusion and exclusion became weapons. The frontier did not rely on courts to tell people how to behave. It relied on consequences that were immediate, personal, and unavoidable. That is why the myth of a completely lawless Wild West does not hold up under scrutiny. A truly lawless place could not sustain trade, migration, or settlement. It would collapse under its own instability. The frontier did not collapse immediately because it adapted. It created a form of law that matched its environment, flexible, informal, and ruthless when necessary. A system that valued order over justice, stability over fairness, and survival over principle. This system was imperfect. It punished innocents. It empowered mobs. It allowed prejudice and personal vendettas to masquerade as order. But it worked long enough to keep towns alive, and that is why it existed. Frontier law was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization stripped down to its most basic function, preventing destruction. Understanding this is essential because everything that follows, reputation, punishment, banishment, and violence, only makes sense when seen through this lens. The Wild West was not a place without law. It was a place where law looked very different. Why formal law failed and sheriffs held little real power. If frontier towns were not lawless, then why did formal law fail so completely? The answer lies not in incompetence, but in mismatch. The legal systems that existed in the eastern United States were designed for settled populations. They assumed stable towns, permanent residents, reliable tax bases, and predictable flows of people and goods. The frontier offered none of these conditions. It was fast, temporary, and constantly changing. Law, as it was written, simply could not keep up. In theory, frontier towns were under the authority of territorial or state governments. In practice, those governments were distant and slow. Communication took weeks. Orders arrived late or not at all. Funding was inconsistent. Appointments were often political rather than practical. A town could rise and fall before the state even noticed it existed. Sheriffs did exist, but their power was far weaker than popular memory suggests. Many sheriffs were elected by local citizens, which meant their authority rested on popularity rather than force. Enforcing an unpopular law could cost a sheriff his job. Enforcing it against the wrong person could cost him his life. Most sheriffs worked alone. Backup was rare. A posse might be assembled in an emergency, but even then, loyalty was uncertain. The men a sheriff relied on were the same men whose favor he depended upon to stay in office. This made aggressive enforcement dangerous. Jails, when they existed, were often little more than wooden rooms with iron bars. They were expensive to maintain and difficult to secure. Feeding prisoners cost money. Guarding them required manpower. Escapes were common. Long-term confinement was unrealistic. Courts were even more impractical. Judges often traveled on circuits, visiting towns only a few times a year. Witnesses might be gone by the time a trial occurred. Evidence was unreliable. Records were incomplete. Justice, delayed by months or years, meant little in a place where people lived day to day. This reality forced law enforcement to become selective. Sheriffs quickly learned that they could not enforce every rule. They prioritized disputes that threatened the town's stability and ignored those that did not. Drunken arguments were often overlooked. Gambling debts were considered private matters. Violence between transients might be tolerated if it ended quickly and did not disrupt business. This was not negligence. It was survival strategy. A sheriff who attempted to enforce the law rigidly would be overwhelmed. A sheriff who enforced it selectively could remain effective as long as the community supported his decisions. This is why the authority of a sheriff was never absolute. His badge carried weight only when backed by public consent. If the crowd turned against him, the badge meant nothing. In many cases, the sheriff functioned less as an enforcer and more as a mediator. He negotiated outcomes. He encouraged settlements. He relied on reputation and pressure rather than force. When violence was unavoidable, he sought support before acting. The idea of a lone lawman imposing order is largely a creation of later storytelling. In reality, frontier law enforcement was collaborative and fragile. This fragility explains why communities developed their own systems of control. When formal law could not act quickly enough, people acted themselves. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Frontier law did not reject authority. It compensated for its absence. And this compensation shaped everything that followed, from reputation-based enforcement to vigilance committees and banishment. The system evolved not because people distrusted law, but because they needed order faster than law could deliver it. The sheriff was part of the system, but he was never its foundation. That foundation lay elsewhere, in the collective judgment of the town itself. Reputation as law. How communities enforced order without courts. If formal law was weak and sheriffs held limited power, something else had to fill the gap. That force was reputation. On the frontier, reputation was not a social detail or a personal concern. It was law itself. In modern society, reputation is often abstract. People can move cities, change jobs, reinvent themselves. Records are kept by institutions, not by neighbors. On the frontier, the opposite was true. Records were scarce, but memory was sharp. People lived close together, depended on one another daily, and noticed everything. In a frontier town, anonymity barely existed. Even newcomers were watched closely. Where you came from, how you behaved, how you spoke, how you paid your debts, all of it mattered. Behavior was observed not casually, but deliberately. Everyone understood that one dangerous individual could threaten the survival of the entire settlement. Reputation formed quickly and hardened fast. A person who worked reliably, paid what they owed, and avoided unnecessary conflict gained quiet acceptance. They were trusted with credit, offered work, and included in social life. This trust was not sentimental, it was practical. Trust meant predictability, and predictability meant safety. A person who lied, cheated, threatened others, or disrupted business gained a different reputation. Their names circulated in saloons and stores. Conversations stopped when they entered a room. Eyes followed them in the street. No accusations were made openly, but judgment was already forming. This judgment carried real consequences. Work on the frontier was rarely formal. Jobs were offered through recommendation and word of mouth. A bad reputation meant fewer opportunities. Employers avoided risk. They preferred someone known to be steady over someone merely capable. Losing work was often the first punishment imposed by the community. Credit was the second. Cash was scarce in many frontier towns. Trade depended heavily on credit. Storekeepers allowed purchases on account. Saloon owners kept tabs. Boarding houses trusted that payment would come later. Credit functioned as both lubricant and lifeline. Reputation determined access to it. When a person fell out of favor, credit vanished quietly. No explanation was required. Goods were suddenly unavailable. Tabs were closed. Prices rose or service was denied altogether. This economic pressure was devastating. Without credit, even basic survival became difficult. This system was extraordinarily effective because it avoided confrontation. No violence was necessary. No authority needed to intervene. The community simply withdrew support. Isolation did the rest. Humans are social by nature. But on the frontier, isolation carried additional danger. Being excluded meant losing access to information, protection, and opportunity. It meant being alone in a harsh environment where cooperation often meant survival. This is why reputation functioned as a law. It was enforced constantly, by everyone without coordination or command. Approval and disapproval were tools. Inclusion and exclusion were punishments. Importantly, the system did not rely on morality. It relied on impact. A man could be crude, immoral by modern standards, or deeply flawed, and still be tolerated if he did not threaten stability. Another could commit a single act that disrupted the town's fragile balance and be marked permanently. The standard was not goodness, it was danger. This also explains why frontier law appears inconsistent. Some people were punished severely for minor offenses, while others escaped consequences for serious ones. The difference was rarely innocence or guilt. It was usefulness. Someone essential to the town, a skilled worker, a merchant, a landowner, might be given leeway. A transient outsider might not. This was not fair, but it was rational within the system. Frontier law prioritized continuity. Reputation also extended beyond individual towns. Frontier settlements were connected by trade routes, migration paths, and shared labor pools. News traveled. Stories followed people. A bad reputation in one town often preceded arrival in the next. This created a network of informal enforcement. A person expelled from one place did not arrive elsewhere as a blank slate. They arrived with a story already attached. In this way, reputation replaced records. Memory replaced documentation. Community judgment replaced courts. But this system had a dark side. Reputation was difficult to challenge once established. False accusations spread easily. Personal grudges could harden into public condemnation. Outsiders, minorities, and the powerless were especially vulnerable. There was little room for appeal and no formal process to correct errors. Once a reputation turned, recovery was rare. This is why frontier law could be both stabilizing and cruel. It prevented chaos, but it did not protect individuals. It valued order over truth and cohesion over justice. Still, for a time, it worked. Most people complied not because they feared punishment, but because they feared exclusion. They watched their behavior carefully. They avoided unnecessary conflict. They followed unwritten rules they had never seen written down. Frontier law lived in glances, whispers, refusals, and silences. It lived in who was hired, who was trusted, and who was quietly pushed out. It was law without statutes, courts, or prisons, and it governed everyday life far more effectively than any badge ever could. Punishment without prisons, vigilance, shaming, and banishment. Reputation could control behavior most of the time, but not always. When social pressure failed, frontier communities escalated. This escalation did not happen casually. Violence was risky. It threatened business, scared settlers, and invited retaliation. But when a person was seen as a persistent danger, someone who ignored warnings, resisted exclusion, or threatened stability, the town responded with direct punishment. This is where frontier law became visible. Unlike modern justice systems, frontier punishment was not designed to rehabilitate. It was not even designed to be proportional. It was designed to remove threats quickly and decisively, using whatever means were available. Prisons were rare on the frontier, and where they existed, they were impractical. Long-term confinement required resources most towns did not have. Prisoners had to be fed and guarded. Escapes were common. Trials were slow. Justice delayed was justice denied, not because it was unjust, but because it was ineffective. As a result, frontier punishment was immediate. One of the most common forms was public shaming. This could take many forms: public accusation, forced apologies, humiliation, or symbolic acts meant to destroy standing. A person's misdeeds were made known openly. Reputation, already damaged, was shattered completely. Public shaming served two purposes. First, it punished the offender without bloodshed. Second, it warned everyone else. The message was not subtle. This is what happens when you cross the line. Economic punishment often followed. Fines were imposed, sometimes informally, sometimes through community pressure. Property could be seized. Tools might be confiscated. Livelihoods were disrupted deliberately. But the most powerful punishment on the frontier was banishment. Banishment was simple and terrifying. The offender was told to leave town immediately or within a short window and never return. There were no appeals, no hearings, no paperwork. The decision came from consensus, not statute. To a modern observer, this may seem mild. In reality, it was devastating. Frontier towns were not isolated. They were nodes in a larger network of settlements, trade routes, and labor markets. News traveled quickly. A banished person did not leave anonymously. They left with a story attached to their name. When they arrived elsewhere, doors were already closed. This is why banishment worked. It did not merely remove someone from one town. It often removed them from society altogether. Without reputation, credit, or trust, survival became uncertain. Some drifted constantly. Others turned to crime. Many simply disappeared. Banishment was punishment by erasure. In cases where banishment was seen as insufficient, communities turned to organized force. Vigilance committees emerged when towns believed formal authority could not or would not act. These committees were not random mobs, though they could become that. They were often composed of respected citizens, merchants, landowners, employers, people with a stake in the town's future. Their justification was always the same: necessity. They claimed to act in defense of order, not vengeance. They investigated accusations, questioned suspects, and imposed sentences. Sometimes they were careful. Sometimes they were reckless. Their power came from participation. The more people involved, the more legitimate the action appeared. This legitimacy was fragile and dangerous. Because vigilance committees operated outside formal law, they had no obligation to be fair. Evidence standards were flexible. Accusations carried weight based on who made them. Personal grudges could be reframed as public threats. Punishments varied. Some committees imposed fines or exile. Others resorted to physical violence. In the most extreme cases, executions occurred without trial. These moments loom large in history because they were dramatic, but they were not the norm. Frontier communities preferred quieter solutions whenever possible. Violence was a last resort, not a default. Still, the existence of vigilance committees reveals something crucial about frontier law. Authority did not flow from institutions, it flowed from the consensus. A punishment was legitimate if enough people agreed it was necessary. This made frontier law flexible and fast, but also unstable. When consensus fractured, chaos followed. This is why frontier justice could swing rapidly from restraint to brutality. A town might tolerate a disruptive individual for months, then suddenly turn on them with overwhelming force. From the outside, this looked arbitrary. From the inside, it felt inevitable. The line had been crossed. Everyone knew it. Punishment on the frontier was rarely about a single act. It was about accumulated behavior. A final incident often served only as justification for a decision already made collectively. This also explains why frontier punishments appear disproportionate. The act itself may seem minor, but the response reflected months or years of tension, fear, and disruption. Frontier law did not reset after punishment. It resolved. Once a decision was made, it was meant to end the problem permanently. This approach kept towns alive, but it came at a cost. Innocent people suffered. Minor offenders were destroyed. Prejudice went unchecked. Power concentrated in the hands of those who shaped consensus. Frontier punishment was efficient, not just. And that distinction matters, because while this system maintained order in unstable environments, it could not sustain a just society. As towns grew, as families arrived, as permanence replaced transience, the tolerance for such methods declined. What worked in a camp of hundreds could not work in a city of thousands. And so frontier punishment, like frontier law itself, was temporary. It existed because it had to. When you are ready, say Section 5, and I will write the final section, bringing together why the system worked, why it failed, and what it reveals about how law actually functions when institutions are absent. Why frontier law worked, why it failed, and what it reveals about human order. Frontier law existed because it had to. It was not designed in theory, debated in assemblies, or refined by philosophers. It emerged from pressure, necessity, and fear. When formal institutions could not function, communities improvised systems of control using the only tools they had: reputation, economics, consensus, and force. The remarkable fact is not that frontier law was flawed. It is that it worked at all. For a time, these informal systems kept order in places where chaos should have been inevitable. Towns survived long enough to attract trade, workers, and eventually families. Commerce flowed. Violence, while present, did not spiral endlessly. Most people complied with unwritten rules without needing to be threatened directly. Frontier law worked because it aligned enforcement with human psychology. People fear exclusion more than punishment. They fear uncertainty more than rules. Frontier systems exploited this instinct perfectly. Reputation-based enforcement did not require constant surveillance or violence. It relied on social pressure that was ever-present and inescapable. Every interaction reinforced norms. Every refusal, every silence, every closed door reminded individuals that they were being watched and judged. This made enforcement continuous rather than episodic. Modern law intervenes after an offense. Frontier law acted before one occurred. Behavior was shaped not by fear of prison, but by fear of being cut off from the group. The punishment was not abstract or distant. It was immediate and personal. Frontier law also worked because it was flexible. Formal law is rigid by design. It values consistency and procedure. Frontier law valued adaptability. Rules could bend to circumstances. Exceptions could be made when survival demanded it. This allowed communities to respond quickly to new threats without waiting for permission or precedent. In unstable environments, speed matters more than fairness. But this same flexibility carried the seeds of failure. Because frontier law had no fixed standards, it was vulnerable to abuse. Power flowed to those who shaped opinion. Reputation could be manipulated. Consensus could be manufactured. Once a person was marked as a threat, there was little protection against excess. This is why frontier law was harshest on outsiders. Newcomers lacked social capital. They had no reputation to defend them. They were unknown, and the unknown is always treated with suspicion in fragile systems. Minor offenses could be interpreted as major threats. Accusations, once made, were difficult to disprove. Frontier law protected the group by sacrificing the individual. This trade-off was accepted because the alternative, instability, seemed worse. But as towns grew and populations diversified, the cost of this approach increased. Innocent people suffered. Personal vendettas escalated into communal punishment. Violence, once restrained, became contagious. Another reason frontier law eventually failed was scale. Informal systems rely on familiarity. They work best when everyone knows everyone else, or at least knows of them. As towns expanded, this familiarity disappeared. Memory weakened. Consensus fractured. Reputation became unreliable. Economic complexity also increased. Property became permanent. Businesses required contracts. Disputes grew more complicated. Informal enforcement could not resolve issues involving land titles, inheritance, or long-term investment. The very success of frontier law made it obsolete. As stability increased, the need for predictability replaced the need for speed. People demanded protection from the group, not just from threats to the group. Rights began to matter more than reputation. Procedure replaced discretion. This transition was uneven and often resisted. Many frontier communities clung to informal justice long after formal institutions arrived. Vigilance committees persisted. Reputation-based exclusion continued. In some places, it still does. But over time, the balance shifted. Formal law did not replace frontier law because it was morally superior. It replaced it because it scaled better. It could function in larger, more complex societies where personal knowledge was impossible and informal consensus unreliable. Yet the legacy of frontier law remains embedded in modern systems. Reputation still matters. Social exclusion still enforces behavior. Economic pressure still disciplines individuals more effectively than legal punishment in many cases. Communities still improvise order when institutions fail. This reveals something uncomfortable but important. Law is not primarily about justice. It is about stability. Justice is an ideal layered on top of order, not a prerequisite for it. Frontier law stripped that truth bare. It showed that societies will accept harsh, unfair systems if they keep chaos at bay. It also showed the dangers of allowing order to exist without safeguards. Frontier law reminds us that authority does not originate in buildings, uniforms, or documents. It originates in collective agreement. When that agreement dissolves, institutions collapse. When it persists, even crude systems can function. This has implications beyond history. Whenever formal authority weakens, during disasters, conflicts, or economic collapse, informal systems reemerge. People rely on reputation, loyalty, and exclusion. They enforce norms socially before they enforce them legally. The frontier was not an anomaly. It was an early example. The Wild West, then, was not a chaotic outlier in history. It was a compressed demonstration of how human societies create order under pressure. Order came from shared fear of collapse. Punishment came from collective judgment. Law emerged from survival instinct. Frontier law was never meant to last. It was a bridge between chaos and institution. It carried communities across instability long enough for something more permanent to take its place. And when it disappeared, it left behind a lesson that still matters. When institutions vanish, people do not become lawless. They become inventive. They create systems that reflect their environment, their fears, and their priorities. Sometimes those systems are effective. Sometimes they are cruel. Often they are both. The Wild West enforced law without police because it had no choice. And in doing so, it revealed what law truly is when stripped of ceremony. A collective decision about what behavior will be tolerated and what will not. That is the frontier's lasting legacy. Order before authority. The Wild West is remembered as chaotic because it was unfamiliar, not because it lacked structure. What truly unsettles us about the frontier is not the violence, but the absence of institutions we rely on today. No reliable police force, no permanent courts, no prisons capable of long-term control. And yet, society did not immediately collapse. Instead, people adapted. They created order from necessity, not ideology. Law emerged from shared survival rather than written principle. Reputation replaced records. Exclusion replaced incarceration. Consensus replaced authority. These systems were imperfect and often cruel, but they reveal a fundamental truth about human societies. Order comes before justice, not the other way around. Frontier law worked because it aligned with the realities of its environment. It was fast because it had to be. It was harsh because it could not afford hesitation. It protected the group at the expense of the individual because instability threatened everyone. In a temporary world, permanence mattered more than fairness. But the same qualities that made frontier law effective also guaranteed its failure. As towns grew, as families arrived, as property became fixed and futures became long-term, informal enforcement became dangerous. Memory was no longer reliable. Consensus fractured. Power concentrated. Innocence had no protection. Formal law did not replace frontier law because it was kinder. It replaced it because it could scale, because it could survive complexity, and because it could restrain the very human impulses that frontier justice depended on. The frontier reminds us that law is not born from morality. It is born from fear of collapse. Justice is something societies strive for only after order is secured. When institutions disappear, people do not become lawless. They become inventive, protective, and ruthless in ways shaped by their circumstances. This is why the Wild West matters. It was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization under pressure, stripped down to its core functions. A demonstration of how humans behave when survival outweighs principle and stability outweighs fairness. Understanding this changes how we see both the past and the present. It explains why informal power still shapes behavior today, why reputation still enforces norms, and why communities still improvise order when authority falters. The Wild West did not enforce law without police because it rejected leak. It did so because it had no choice. And if you found this exploration of frontier justice insightful, hit that like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden systems that shaped history.